Živijo, tukaj je Anže, poslušate podcast Aparatus, kjer legitimni člani družbe povejo, kaj počnejo v življenju. Tole pa je 105. epizoda Aparatusa, v kateri sem govoril s Tomom Standageom, ki je v bistvu podurednik oziroma digitalni urednik tednika The Economist, najbrž enega največjih tednikov na svetu, vsaj v zahodnem svetu. Tako da gre že spet za enega od unih iz rubrike, ne vem zakaj so se z mano pogovarjali. Valjda so se pogovarjali malo o tisku, pa o internetu, pa kako se eno z drugim razume, pa kako je pri njih na The Economistu in pa pol za malo prihodnosti, pa o špiljanju iger in podobno. Na koncu je valjda povedal, katero strojno in programsko opremo uporablja. Zdaj naprej začnejo s Tomom. Še enkrat ful hvala vsem, ki ste že podprli Aparatus in pa unim, ki ga še boste. To naredite tako, da greste na aparatus.si/podpri. Vem, da to vsakič rečem, ampak res vsak evro prav pride in ne bi nikoli prelezel tako daleč, če ne bi bilo te podpore. Tako da res še enkrat ful hvala. Drugač pa, ne vem, dajte kakšno oceno v iTunesih Aparatusov, pogledajte še ostale podcaste na mreži, to naredite tako, da greste na aparatus.si. To je več ali manj to. Evo, zdaj pa Tom, resno. Človek, ki dela na Economistu, z mano se pogovarja, ne vem zakaj. So who are you and what do you do?
So I am Tom Standage and I am deputy editor at The Economist. And what I do, I suppose, is I think about where The Economist needs to go in the digital future. So I that involves a lot of things. It involves digital strategy. It involves talking to people. It involves developing new products. It involves trying to change the culture inside the company. So it's a lot of different things. But essentially, I have the responsibility for sort of making sure that we go in the right direction with our digital output.
Okay, so, and just to be clear, you've been there for quite a while, right?
I've been here a long time. Yes, I've been at The Economist for 17 years, and I started as science correspondent in 1998, and I've done various things since then. I've covered tech for the business pages. I've been the business editor. I've run the back half of the paper, as we call it. So that's the business, the finance, and the science sections. And I've been the digital editor, and I've run the Tech Quarterly. I did that for about a decade as well, in parallel with a lot of those other jobs. So there's usually been a sort of business tech side to the coverage when I've actually been writing stories. And it meant that when things like apps came along and when our web strategy started to become more important, I went from not just sort of writing about what companies should do generally, but also I became involved in deciding what we should be doing specifically at The Economist.
And before we get into that and the new products, because I do want to ask you about that. You did mention something that I wanted to ask about, changing the culture, right?
Yeah.
Because that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because you've been at a newspaper, right, before all of this happened. And by this, I mean the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, sort of. Actually, I haven't quite, because what got me into journalism was the internet. So I studied computer science at Oxford, and I knew I did engineering and computer science. I knew I didn't want to be an engineer, and maybe I should have just gone into software, but at the time, you couldn't do computer science on its own at Oxford, and so I ended up doing this degree that was quite a broad grounding in physical sciences. Anyway, I then did, after university, I did a number of things. I worked a bit as a programmer. I did some photography. I did some copywriting. I did some technical illustration. I did a bunch of different things. And then the thing that happened was the internet became a consumer product, as it were. And right at the beginning of, I think it was 1994, I got my first dial-up connection. I'd been on CompuServe for a couple of years, but essentially it became obvious then. By this time, I was writing for some computer magazines as well. I was doing software reviews and that sort of thing. And it became obvious that nobody knew about this. And so I started pitching stories to the newspapers, and I started writing for The Guardian. And I went to The Guardian for a year and worked on their new internet supplement, because everyone was creating internet supplements in those days. And then The Telegraph, which is another British newspaper, decided they wanted to do the same. So they stole me, and I went there for 2 years. But I could see that the whole kind of phenomenon of these internet supplements in magazines, in newspapers, was a short-term phenomenon. It was just a way to get advertising money from the ISPs and the manufacturers of modems. And so I thought, this is not going to last. I have to go to a publication that does not rely on this short-term boost. I have to switch over. So I decided that I'd always read The Economist, and I decided what I wanted to do was move to The Economist and work on the science pages. And I had the background in physical sciences from my engineering degree. So my last year at the Telegraph, I wrote every article I wrote, deliberately I wrote it in Economist style, which meant that when I then applied for a job at The Economist, I could produce all these clips and say, look, I've been running this section at the at the Telegraph. I can write in this style. You can trust me. I can do this job. And so they hired me. And in fact, the second week I was here, I had to run the science section. So they obviously decided I was trustworthy as an editor as well. Anyway, so that was how I got into journalism. And then I thought I'd got away from writing about the internet, but of course it came inevitably. It became very important. So I've ended up now in a situation where I am at the top of a news organisation that is struggling with this, and the thing it's struggling with is something I know a lot about and have seen evolve for the last 25 years. I used the internet for the first time when I was a student at Oxford in 1989, and I'm a coder, and so I can see into the tech world, I can see into the journalism world, and I also understand about the business models of startups and the landscape of the internet industry, as it were, because I covered that for many years as well as a correspondent. So I am able to see into those three worlds, which should mean that I'm in a good position to figure out what we should do about it.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, you can look into those places, but then you have to sort of look forward, and that's where the fun begins, I guess.
Well, and then on the looking forward, another thing I've done in parallel with all of this is write history books. And one of the ways I look forward is by writing history books, because the subtext of all my history books is, what can the past tell us about the future? So that's one way of looking forward. Journalism itself is a way of looking forward, because ultimately what's happening here is that I'm obsessed with the future, and I investigate it in three ways: through history, through journalism, because journalism allows me to talk to people who are living in the future today. The William Gibson idea that the future is unevenly distributed. So talking to people, I went in a self-driving car in Shanghai traffic the other day. Those sorts of things, talking to the people who are inventing the future, is another way of trying to work out what it looks like. And the third way I try and work out what it looks like is by reading lots of sci-fi, because I think it's the sci-fi authors have really thought about this, and if you choose the right ones, and I find that very helpful as well.
Wait! Choose the right ones. What does that mean exactly?
Well, I think you have to read hard sci-fi, so they have to be. I'm not interested in sci-fi that has magic or dragons or tips over into fantasy. But I like with Ian Banks or Alistair Reynolds is my current favourite. And so he's a former European Space Agency scientist who now has switched over full time to being an author. And he writes, I really, really like what he does. He's very good on post-humanism, transhumanism, and the implications of that. And he's also very good on something I'm particularly interested in at the moment and reading a lot of sci-fi about is augmented reality and what a world of ubiquitous augmented reality looks like. That's something that he's just baked that into several of his books. So I find that, and it's not even what the books are about. I mean, the books are often about something else, but they're set in a future where the org, as he calls it, is ubiquitous. So I find that very interesting. And with Ian Banks, he's writing about these orbitals, these giant ring worlds that you see in video games like Halo, and you can tell that he's done the math, or he's got someone to do it for him, so that how fast you have to spin a ring of a certain size to get 1G on the inside rim. He's clearly done his homework. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for in a science fiction author.
Okay, fair enough. Like, I was not expecting an answer to that one, but yeah, awesome. Okay, just to drag back a little, because the whole culture changing thing.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's where we. Sorry.
Yeah, that's where we want. Because I really do want to sort of talk to you about that.
Yeah.
Because I'm sort of in a similar situation at the magazine I work for, right? And that sort of, I never foresaw that, because I was always looking from my own brain out, and I just figured that everybody would see sort of the internet for.
No, so I think there are two. I think there are two big challenges. There's the normal challenge, as it were, that all companies face, which is that when you try to pivot the company towards the internet, there are always going to be people who think that it's a hobby, that it's a fad, it's going to go away. And so you have to sort of try and persuade them it's not the case. And, in our case, when I started trying to get people to do more for our website, and I didn't want to do what a lot of news organizations do, which is have a separate team of people who write for the web, because I think that's just, ultimately, that's not the long-term solution. You've got to have the same editorial team, and particularly with The Economist, because we have a line, we have a position on everything. You can't have a specialist writing for the print edition who knows and sets our line on a particular subject, and then have someone else writing for the web, because they just aren't going to necessarily align, and you're going to lose that consistency, which is a very important part of our brand. So I really wanted the expertise and the knowledge of the print journalists to be applied online. So in the early days of trying to make that happen, there were people who said, well, why are we doing this? What would you like us to do less of, so that we can make time for this? And you have to be able to answer those questions. And you have to be able to say that this is important, and in the long term, this is where we're probably going to end up. So you need leadership from the top. You need the editor-in-chief to say this is important. And the editor-in-chief at the time, John, made that case, and Zanny, his successor, who took over in January, has made that case more forcefully. I think she's actually made it easier in that regard. So people can tell this is something that we have to do. But the other thing is just the numbers. I mean, The Economist makes about £20 million a year in advertising revenue from its website, and that's less than 10% of our overall revenues, but it's still a serious amount of money. And so you say to people, well, this isn't a hobby. The assumption that the web is just a sort of money pit that we're losing money on, and that life would be much easier if we just didn't bother, that's not true. We have to do this strategically, but if for no other reason, it actually makes us quite a lot of money. So and some people were quite surprised to hear that. They had assumed that we were losing, because they assumed that all internet companies fail and go bust, except...
Well, I'm one of them. Yeah, that surprised me as well. So yeah.
Yeah. So I think actually showing people the data and saying, look, this is how many people come, and this is how many people read the stories, and this is how big the audience is, and this is how much money we're making, and actually a lot of journalists are rightly focused on writing their stories, and they're not really that interested in the figures for the company. And maybe they look at the circulation, but that's about all. But the internet allows us to see all these numbers, and so I think some people at least can be persuaded using them. That's one thing. The other thing is we've had a demographic shift in the last few years, where we've had more people come into senior roles in the Economist, which is quite a small, flat organisation anyway, who've grown up with using the internet a bit more, and they are happy to go on Twitter, and they don't think it's all a distraction from their real jobs. In fact, we see this in history. When the telephone appeared, people said, how will anyone get any work done? Because, they'll just be talking on the telephone all day. And we now recognise that talking on the telephone is like a legitimate part of your job. And answering email, well, that takes up, hours of your day. But actually, a big part of my job is answering email, because that's how you make decisions and tell people what to do. Although there are other things too. So Slack is another thing. Anyway, so and we're big fans of that. Anyway, but I think there's the general problem of how you get an organisation to take the internet seriously, and there are going to be different ways of doing that in different companies with different cultures. But I think that's a problem that, like, all industries have had to deal with. In news organisations, there is a more specific problem, which is that we have this tradition of a church-state divide. So we have the editorial staff separated from the commercial staff, and this is a good thing. And you don't want the editorial staff to be kind of worrying about how much an article that they write annoys an advertiser or something. You want to keep them apart. But the problem we have now is that the stronger that Chinese wall between editorial and commercial is, actually the worst position you're in now, because there are a lot of functions, not editorial, choosing which subjects to write about. That needs to be separate. But there are a lot of other functions where it's very important that editorial talks to the rest of the organisation on things like technology development, because we have to use these tools for our website and for our apps and so on, and we have to be involved in deciding what the new products are, and we can't just have the commercial people doing that for us and saying, now you write the articles and we'll pipe them in. So we have to be involved in that. We have to be involved in social media. It's not just a marketing function. It has to be something that editorial's involved in. Analytics is something else. We have to be, we have to have an editorial analytics team, and then obviously you can have a marketing analytics team as well if you want, but they need to talk to each other. So there are all of these areas where it's really important that journalists talk to the people in the organisation that they previously haven't talked to. And you need to do all of that while maintaining the editorial independence. So that is a second and sort of unique to this industry challenge on the whole question of how you change the culture, because you need to get people to think about talking to people in other parts of the organisation that maybe they wouldn't have done before. And that's a particular challenge, as I say, for news organisations.
Yeah, see, that's the part I wanted to talk to you about, especially with social. I guess I'll dwell on that a little. But like you said, that Chinese wall that divides like editorial and everybody else, at least my feeling is, and maybe you'll agree or disagree, but like journalists were never sort of made to, that's a strong word, but they never felt the need to sort of, make their presence known. Like the paper or the, television station sort of made that, that just happened by default. If you know what I mean?
Well, I don't know about that. I think a lot of journalists write books, and we like going on the telly and on the radio. So
that's fair, yeah.
A lot of us are, naturally self-promoters. Not everyone is, and so, but the naturally self-promoting ones will jump on Twitter and very happily promote their own work and that of their colleagues and that of anything else they think is interesting. So those people do it anyway. You're right, though. There are journalists who say, "Look, it isn't my job, and I don't see why I should do this," and you'll persuade some of them. The value of Twitter isn't just that, you use it to tell people about how awesome you are. You actually learn a great deal from it. And journalists in particular are, hooked on Twitter. In fact, it distorts the way we cover Twitter. We kind of there's a presumption in a lot of media coverage of Twitter that like everyone in the world is on Twitter, and it's not true. My mother is not on Twitter, and I don't think she ever will be. I just can't see what she would do. And Twitter is frankly quite confusing. I mean, this is the big problem they have with their user growth slowing. And the other thing about Twitter is, my wife is a big fan of social media of all kinds, in particular photo-based social, but she sort of said, okay, I'll do Twitter, because she'll sign up for every new social network like I do. And it was only after sort of 18 months of being on Twitter that she finally had one of those moments that you have on Twitter where, enough of your friends are online at the same time that you end up having a spontaneous discussion about something, and people who but haven't met each other end up talking to her. And it's just really great. And she had one of these things happen, and she said, I can see why you like Twitter now. I can finally see the point of it. But you only get to that point when you've got, a few hundred followers, and it probably takes a year, and you really have to invest the time. And it's very, very hard for Twitter to communicate that to new users. And it's so... I think that's fundamentally their problem. Anyway, going back to journalists and Twitter. So some journalists will do it naturally. They'll recognise that it's very useful as a source of information, even if it's just of industry gossip, frankly. And you can see what's going on. And, when you're waiting for an announcement to come out or a press release or something like that, Twitter is the place to go, because someone somewhere is going to be the first to tweet it. And that's where the news is going to appear first. So that's great, and you can persuade some people with that. There was definitely a shift in the industry after the Arab Spring, where so much of the news was breaking on social that people in newsrooms, and I've had many people tell me this in different news organisations, who were sceptical about this, suddenly realised that they needed to be on social media and needed to be on Twitter and finding out what was going on, and also they would start to notice that their colleagues who had jumped on Twitter and were really pushing hard on it, had gathered, tens of thousands of followers, and they were saying, well, why are they I should be able to do that. So there was a little bit of a catch up then. So I think you can persuade some people in the middle, but I think there will always be some people who just say, you know what, I'm not going to do this. I'll let other people do it. And I think you just have to accept that some people aren't, and that's fine. And you need to, ideally what you want to do as a news organisation or as any company is you want to take advantage of the people on the staff who are naturally good at this. And they do emerge, and you can see who they are. And then you say, right, this person really knows what they're doing. And we have a few stars like that on the staff, who are just naturally brilliant at writing, at writing tweets and using social media. And so that you then say, right, we're going to have them run the social media for the Economist, and that's the way we do it.
And just one more thing on that. How do you reconcile that? Because it is more work. That's a given, right? If you're a journalist that didn't deal with the internet before.
Yes, it is. Well, it is. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, it is a way of finding out what's going on. So it does fit in with the kind of, you're looking for stories side of the job, and it fits in with reporting. And I very often find if I know enough people on Twitter that if I want to, I can send a DM to someone inside a company and say, have you heard about this, or what's going on here, or can you comment on this? I did a couple of interviews the other day. We launched. I was on the other side of the fence, as it were. We launched our new Venture Economist films, and a couple of publications did stories about it. And one of them was Bloomberg, and the Bloomberg journalist. I was playing the drums at the time, so I was in a rehearsal studio playing the drums, and he wanted an interview. So I ended up just giving him what he wanted over DM. We did a very quick interview over Twitter DM, and it was great actually. And I think I'd like to do interviews like that in the future, because you've got a transcript, and he basically wanted quotes or sound bites, and Twitter kind of forces you to write them. So I thought that worked really well. But anyway, so in that case, he was using Twitter to get quotes for his story, and I've done that the other way around as well, because very often you'll end up being followed by and following people who are quite difficult to get access to, but you do end up talking to them on Twitter. So I talk to people. I talk to Mark Andreessen sometimes on Twitter. I've only met him a couple of times in real life, but funnily enough, we end up talking on Twitter about bourbon.
Yeah, the important stuff, yeah.
Exactly. Quartz actually made an article about the discussion about bourbon, because it turned out that Mark likes a particular bourbon called Weller 12. And so the article was, if you're pitching to Mark Andreessen, this is the bourbon to take him. Which meant that bourbon immediately sold out around the world, so you now can't get it. But anyway, why am I saying this? Because basically I think it is more work. In some ways, but it does also substitute for other kinds of journalistic work. So the other thing we did, for example, with some of our editors who used to have to maintain topic pages, subject pages on our website, we have a homepage, and then we have like a business homepage, and then we have an Asia homepage, and that kind of thing. And you look at the numbers, and it's pretty obvious that the number of people going to the homepage is declining as a proportion of the overall traffic. Most people are coming in through the side door of social or search. Mm-hmm. But we've got to have a homepage, so we still do that. But the other homepages we had for these other subject areas, we had people curating them, but it probably wasn't worth it. I mean, the amount of traffic those pages were getting, frankly, you could have a reverse cron feed of our stories on Asia, and that would be 99% as good for 99% of visitors. So one of the things we did last year was we got rid of those pages, we replaced them with automatic feeds, and then we said to the people who were maintaining them, who were the people in the Asia section in this example who were responsible for that, we'd say, right, instead of doing that, instead of spending 5 hours a week doing that, we would rather you spent that time on social promotion. So I think if you're going to put things on people's plates, then you have to recognise that they haven't got an infinite amount of time, and so you're much more likely to get them to do something like social if you take something else off their plate at the same time. The
thing I wanted to ask about, sticking with culture for just one more question, I guess.
Yeah.
You said it was pretty much a flat structure at The Economist.
Yeah, I mean, it's a small organisation, so there's only sort of 90 journalists working on the magazine, and then there's a layer of section editors, and then there are sort of 5 senior editors at the top. So stories go up through to the section editor and then the department head, and then they get read by the editor-in-chief or the deputy editor. And that, the Wall Street Journal used to have 5 or 6 layers of editors, I think. I mean, so as organisations go, it's quite small, and most people are sort of 2 hops away from the top person. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So the other thing about it is that we don't have a lot of things that a lot of newspapers have. We don't have any sub-editors, and we don't have any leader writers. So that makes things simpler as well. And then the other weird thing about it is we don't really have a very strong divide between writers and editors. So nearly all of the writers edit and nearly all of the editors write. That means that the structure is quite fluid, because, when the Asia editor's away, someone in the Asia section will stand in and be the Asia editor, and they will then be one step up the hierarchy. So there is a kind of general, it's a small group of people, smaller than the Dunbar number, so we all know each other. And as a result, you don't get sort of, massive bureaucratic problems that, you need to have sort of departmental meetings and things like that to make decisions. And the other thing is that the editor, has an enormous amount of power to just say, we're going to do this, and we all get on with it. So all of that on the editorial side of things makes for, I think, quite a efficient and decisive way of doing things. And, that makes for a very healthy and happy working environment.
I'm glad you said efficient and decisive instead of agile, because that's, that.
Well, there's a debate about, exactly. So on the commercial side, obviously, they're very keen on agile. But yes, we don't, agile is its own terminology. But no, I think the main thing is that that Zanny is very, very decisive and says what she wants, and we all get on with it. And also, there aren't layers and layers of bureaucracy to getting things done, and it's quite a small academic kind of atmosphere. We don't have an open plan newsroom. We have small offices, and it feels quite academic. We're running out of space in our office though, so we may need to switch to open plan. But
don't do that. Just don't.
Well, we may not have any choice, but some bits of the office are open plan already. So yeah, but I know what you mean. We kind of mess with the culture at our peril because it does work very well.
Yeah, that's always a tricky thing when the office changes, man. That's always weird.
Yeah, exactly.
Always. Okay, so when you said the history books and stuff, right? I should tell you, there's a Slovene podcast where they spent, I think, an hour and a half on your latest book.
Oh, right. Excellent.
Just so you know, yeah, there's like 3 people talking about the writing on the wall. So.
Oh, right. Brilliant.
Well, okay, but, you said you look backwards to sort of look forward, right? And I correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole conceit of the book is that basically social media is not a new thing.
Yeah. The idea is that social media can be traced back to the Roman period, and so if you define social as media you get from other people, and for most of history that's how you got information. You got it from your friends, and you all wrote letters to each other, or you sent each other poems, or you exchanged commonplace books, or you passed pamphlets around, or whatever. And of course that was how it had to work, because there was no mass media, there was no broadcast. So what we had in the 19th century and then in the 20th century, but starting in the middle of the 19th century, was the invention of machines that made it possible to deliver information very efficiently to large audiences in one direction. And that was what kind of gave birth to the mass media. And we got a whole load of business models around that, of radio and TV stations and of mass circulation newspapers. Because newspapers were very small. I mean, the biggest newspaper in the world at the beginning of the 19th century was the Times of London. It had a circulation of 8,000. So, newspapers were mostly local social platforms up to that point. And then the steam press meant that you could have a circulation of 1 million. So what that did was it raised barriers to entry to media, because in order to be a broadcaster or a newspaper proprietor, you needed to be able to buy a radio transmitter or a warehouse full of printers, printing presses. And so, the New York Times and other newspapers like that were started, or even The Economist, that were started in the 1840s and the 1850s, was started on, with a $1,000 or $2,000. I mean, it was the barriers to entry were low. Anyway, then the barriers to entry become high, and you get this very high concentration. And then what the internet does around 2000 is it essentially undermines that model, because it says, well, now there is a way to reach a mass audience without having to invest in all of that equipment. So we now recognize that the mass media era was a short-term phenomenon brought about by the lack of an efficient way to reach a large audience cheaply. So we're now that's why all the mass media business models are unraveling, because they were based on this short-term phenomenon and the short-term monopolies that came with it. And it also means that the way that we get information now is much more likely to be mediated by our friends and our social circles, which is the way things worked before mass media. So that's why I'm kind of saying, well, if we go and look at how media worked before the steam press and before the radio transmitter, then it will tell us a lot more about the dynamics of social media environments than you might think.
So but does that happen again? And I know, in the long term, I guess it's going to happen again. Because I think your divide was old media, right? Mass media and then new media, or something like that.
No. So the traditional divide is old media and new media. So old media was radio and newspapers and TV, and then new media was the internet, right? And that's the way we've been used to thinking about things. But what I'm saying is that old media isn't that old. The old media models only start in the 1830s. And if you look at the media before that, which is what I call really old media.
Oh, really old. Sorry. Yeah, really old. Okay.
Really. So really old media is kind of the Roman period up to 1833. And really old media looks a lot like new media. And it's old media in the middle that's the kind of special case.
Yeah, see, that's the thing I found fascinating when I saw a talk of yours recently that you did at Google, right? And it reminded me all of the stuff in the book. But the thing is, that just sounds like the CD in the music industry.
Yeah.
That's basically it, right? It was just this basically brief period of time where you were able to make serious amounts of money.
Well, or vinyl as well. I mean, because the way people heard music, I mean, it's obvious in retrospect. The way people heard music in the past was they heard people performing it, or they sang at home, or they sang in church, or whatever. And so music was a social medium at that point. And then you get the industrialization of music in the 20th century, well, starting in the late 19th century with, the phonograph and so on. And it becomes a thing you get through the radio and through buying records and so on. And now, in theory at least, you can listen to a much wider range of music, and you can get social recommendations for music from your friends. And so it's a bit more like the way it was before, and more people can publish their music to for consumption by the public than could before. So that it's another example of the same phenomenon, that we used to have this very, very tightly regimented industry where the gatekeepers were the record companies, and they decided who got heard and who didn't. And now actually we're back to if you could make enough people interested in your blog or music or whatever, then you could build an audience for it.
Yeah, you see, that's where it breaks down for me, because if that's true, if you're English or American or like French.
Yeah.
There's 2 million people in Slovenia.
Right.
Like there's no way to sustain stuff like that. That's what I find so fascinating.
But you're doing it by doing things in English. I mean, you're building a wider audience than just in Slovenia by doing a podcast in English. So,
that is true. Yeah. So,
I mean, that's a good example whereas previously, would you have been able to, as a Slovenian interested in interesting things, would you have been able to amass or create a global community of people? I mean, I think you are an example of this, and that, and if you were, depending on the medium you're working in, if you were a musician or an artist, then the language barrier would be much less important. So you would be able to, if your work was if people liked it, and enough people thought it was a good thing, then again you could establish a name for yourself in a way that you might have had trouble doing so before.
Well, yeah, but the other place where that breaks down, like that's all fine, right? But when you have to deal with, we're like a sovereign nation, we have our own like politics and stuff. And when you have to deal with that, right? I don't know how I'll say, old media, right? Like how that transitions into the web era without it all going to just all falling apart, basically.
Well, no, you make a good point, which is that one of the things, the idea of the nation state, the rise of the nation state in the 19th century is actually very closely aligned with the advent of these new media technologies. One of the things you could do to bind a country together is if everyone's reading the same news, if everyone's reading the same newspaper and listening to the same radio station. A really good example is Italy. So Italy had, before it was unified in whatever it was, 1875, it had quite a lot of different dialects that were mutually indistinguishable. As soon as you start to get national newspapers and national radio, you start to homogenize the language, and you actually introduce a sense of national unity, which might not have been there before. So actually this idea of media and national unity going together is quite a well-established one. But what does that mean when you don't have national media anymore? Does that mean that? And I think, so you start to see this already. You start to see that people identify themselves in sort of tribes rather than countries. So my daughter is a good example. My daughter is a huge fan, and there are many, many people, she's a teenager, many people her age around the world who are huge fans of Japanese anime. And they love anime, they love the tropes, they love the way that it's a kind of modern day mythology. And there are all of these stories, and there are new ones coming out all the time, and they can go and watch the old ones. And she has a lot more in common with anime fans in different countries around the world than she does with people in her street who aren't into anime. In some respects, so you do get this kind of and you get the same with music. You don't really get national. You maybe do in some languages, but you now get tribes of people around the world who like different kinds of music rather than just liking the music in their country. And so this is the kind of effect that digital media has. And you can argue that it makes nation states less viable. We're seeing we're seeing more interest in city level economies. People talk about the C60, is it? The 60 biggest, and most economic activity is focused in cities. So you're starting to see quite a few examples of nation states being relatively less important. I don't know whether that means they go away altogether and become irrelevant, but certainly you could make the case that they're less significant than they used to be. And there are many reasons for that, but but digital technology is certainly one of them.
Oh yeah, well that's sort of when you talk to a guy from a country with 2 million people, that sounds just daunting. Like that's scary as hell. But I guess. Right. But yeah, it does make sense. But you see that's why I sort of like talking to you guys, because you do get to, when you said what's the circulation of The Economist?
1.6 million.
Yeah, that's insane, right? That's basically the number of adults.
The entire population of Slovenia. I see what you mean. Yes.
Yeah. You see, and that's where it gets really, really interesting to me, right? Because when you guys talk about it, it's sort of, some of the things are just a given. Some of those things when you say, and we should talk about the new sort of digital products you've launched at The Economist, especially Espresso, which I find awesome, right?
Right. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but stuff like that, sort of just it's viable out of the box for you guys. Do you see what I mean?
Well, yes. We're very lucky. So Espresso was interesting because the thinking behind it was tech firms think about products in a particular way. They think that the value is in the technology. And then media companies tend to think that the value is in the content and that the technology that you use to deliver it is just a detail. And actually, in order to make a successful news product in the future, we need to think about the content and the technology and the business model all together. And we don't need to just take our existing articles and funnel them into an app and expect people to read them every day. So with Espresso, I looked at it and said, well, if we're going to make a daily briefing product, which is what I wanted to do. So in other words, something that does the same job for readers each day that The Economist Weekly does each week. So the job that the weekly does is you curl up with it on Friday or Saturday and you read it for about an hour and a half, and then it tells you what's going on in the world. And then when you've done that, you go, great, I've finished it. So it's giving you a finite bundle of content that you can actually finish in a world of infinite streams. And that's really the value of what we do. It's that filtering. We're a trusted filter for our readers. So I thought, well, we're doing that on a weekly basis, and that's clearly something that people want. And in fact, the noisier the media environment gets, the more people seem to want it. But shouldn't we have a daily version of that as well? And so then I started to think, well, what would that look like? And I thought, well, it wouldn't have the kind of classic Economist 700-word articles in it. If we're going to build this for quick consumption on a smartphone in the morning, a shot of information like an espresso shot, which is where the name comes from, then we should actually make a new kind of article format. So we came up with these 150-word pieces we call chunks. So there's a kind of new editorial model there. Then there's the business model for how we do it, which is we make it free to existing subscribers, but we allow new subscribers to subscribe to it. And obviously it costs less than a subscription to The Economist Weekly. So we hope it's a sort of stepping stone product for new readers. And then there's the technology, which is, we'll do this as an app. We'll also do it as an email, but mainly it's presented as an app. And so I went and built the first prototype, and I presented the whole thing to the board and said, this is what I think we should do. This is the editorial model. This is the business model. This is how the technology would work. And they said, yes, do it, and produce the money. So we then did it as an internal startup. And the great thing about that is that we had the freedom of action of a startup, but we also had the resources of the existing Economist group to draw on. So obviously we had the journalists, because the same journalists writing Espresso who were writing the weekly. We had the marketing of The Economist. We had the brand. We had the audience, and we could then roll it out to the audience and say, here it is, and straight away have a weekly reach of 200,000 people. So there are. What we were trying to do was borrow the right bits from the startup world and the startup culture and look at what the interesting new news apps were doing and say, well, what's the Economist response to that? So in that respect, we are looking at what the tech industry is doing and what startups are doing, and at the same time take advantage of the benefits of being a storied news organization with a big circulation and a big brand and lots of other resources we can draw on. So that's the sort of genesis of Espresso.
Okay, just one point on that, because I listened to the periodic list that you did with Glenn, and that sort of notion of finishing stuff.
Finishability
right?
is absolutely key. Yes.
Like I would have never thought of that.
Well, this is. I mean, I've been banging on about this for a while, but I think it's quite important. It is the USP of The Economist hidden in plain sight, which is that you can get to the end of it. And the reason that the job, you can also look at this in terms of Clayton Christensen's jobs to be done framework. What is the job we do for readers? The job is ultimately we save them time, but we figure out what's important and tell them. And if you haven't got time to read everything, which you don't, because no one can read everything, you never finish the internet. You never finish Twitter. You can't even finish the New York Times. So that feeling of finishing when you get to the end, that satisfaction that you've caught up and you're no longer feeling overwhelmed by new information, that's really what we're selling. The feeling of being smarter and on top of the news when you get to the end. There's a very nice quote from Larry Ellison of Oracle, who is an economist reader, which kind of summarizes this. And he says, I used to think, now I just read The Economist. And, obviously that's exaggerating a bit, but the idea is that, we have thought really hard about what the most important events are this week and what you should think of them and what they mean. And that means that, we can deliver all of that to you on a plate. You can read it and finish it, and then that gives you permission to do something else. Okay,
so and in that vein, like, you sort of, everything I've read about, like when you talk about the stuff or listen to you on podcasts and stuff and interviews, I get the sense that you do realize that The Economist is sort of, when you said it's a storied newspaper and, with a trusted filter and all of that stuff, like there's a sense you do sort of, you take that into account and you know that you're lucky that you read The Economist, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, no, I would say, I would go further than that and say an awful lot of, because I'm asked to explain our business model to people a lot, because, we're still a profitable news organisation and our circulation is doing well and so on. And they say, well, what's the secret? And there isn't a secret. I'm very happy to be very open about all of this stuff because basically it's not really something that anyone else can emulate. And it's not because of a particularly clever model. An awful lot of this is luck. So we were very lucky that we are a publication in English, because that turns out to be great. That turns out to mean that you can address a very large audience.
Yeah, can I amend that a little? You're a publication in English based in England, but the Americans read you, right?
Well, no. So so we started off mostly readers in England, and we only really started pushing into the US in the 70s. And we really started to do well in the 90s because globalization was happening, and we provide a global view of the world and of world news and of the week's news. And a lot of American publications tend to kind of report as if America is the only place in the world. So there was demand not just in the US but actually around the world from people who wanted a global perspective. And as you know, globalization, the idea that companies need to think globally and there are global markets in capital and ideas and labor and so on. We very much benefited from that because that's always been our perspective, the view from the moon, you could call it. So that was one thing that helped. And particularly during the 90s and the Bush years of the 2000s, there was a very strong demand in America for a perspective on America from outside.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so most of our readers are in North America. So more than half of our 1.6 million, something like 900,000, are in the US and Canada. So we are trusted to tell you what's going on, but we're not in the US. So we're a sort of trusted external view of things. So that has benefited us enormously as well. Another thing that has helped us is the fact that we've never relied very heavily on advertising as part of our business model. So we've always had more than 50% of our revenue coming from subscribers. And that meant that when advertising fell very dramatically, in the last 10 years or so, it had much less of an impact on us than it has had on other newspapers. And in particular, American newspapers, where 90% of their revenue came from advertising in some cases. So we're at about 65% revenue from subscriptions now, and only about something like 15% of the rest, only about 15% of the revenue is actually from advertising. But a lot of the rest of the revenue comes from other things. So we are well insulated, relatively speaking, against the gradual decline of display advertising, not just in print, but online. I mean, display advertising is a less and less viable business wherever you look. Unless you're Google and Facebook, it's just a horrible business to be in. So all of those things, being in English, not being in English, but being in England, not being in America, and the nature of the business model and so on were just good luck. And, they're very, very hard things to copy. If you Google the expression "more like The Economist" in quotes, which I like to do sometimes for a laugh, then you will find the editors of Newsweek and Time and various other magazines say, I'm going to make it more like The Economist. Now, it's very, very hard for you to do that if you are an American publication, because one of the things that have helped us is not being American, but also having a strong brand and also keeping our subscription prices high. We've had to keep them high, but we've been able to justify that premium price because people value what we produce. But a lot of those other news magazines went for low subscription prices so that they could maximize their audiences for advertising purposes. And that model doesn't work anymore because the advertising revenue isn't there. And it's then very, very hard to raise your price from a $15 annual subscription to $130, which is where we are. And you can see Newsweek trying to do it now. They're trying to raise their prices. So all of those things are factors in our success, and they're in many cases quite hard to emulate if you're other people, which is why I'm very happy to talk about what they are.
Well, yeah, because I know politically that this comparison doesn't really make sense, but like the only analogous thing that I've seen in America that sort of works is the New Yorker.
Yes, so the New Yorker is the next most expensive magazine after us. So our subscription is $130. That's just for print or digital. It's $165 for both. The New Yorker is something like $70, I think. And I love the New Yorker, and I my favourite reading when I get on a plane, I want to have the New Yorker and the Economist in my bag or on my phone so that I can read them, and I think they're very sort of complementary. The New Yorker is clearly, it's not a global perspective; it's very much rooted in a place in New York, and that's part of its attraction. So no, I like the New Yorker very much, but it loses money. I mean, it's subsidized by the rest of Condé Nast, essentially. So even though it's quite expensive, I think it's still a loss-making publication. And then all the other magazines are even, have even lower subscription prices than that.
Yeah. Okay. So as two outsiders, right? I did want to ask you, like, how do you see like the whole situation in America shaking out?
Yeah.
Like the print magazine. Now, and that's like, I know that's sort of a broad question and you can't really answer it in like 2 sentences.
No, well, I think you can. I mean, I think essentially going back to my sort of 2,000-year view of media history, I think we had a lot of local monopolies, particularly in the US, metro area newspapers, where if you were a car dealership, there was only one newspaper or maybe two newspapers where you were going to put your ads, and there was only one radio station or maybe two radio stations, and all of those papers and news and radio stations, but particularly the papers, have to compete with all the other papers in America and all the other papers in the world. So that's kind of quite difficult, unless you've got very valuable local content that people will pay for, which generally means local sports content. That seems to be the thing that is keeping the local papers alive. But essentially, there was a temporary period where it was possible to have these very lucrative local monopolies, and that period has come to an end. And that means the number of newspapers is going to go down, particularly in America. But I think it will go down across the board. I think the number of British newspapers. I think there are more newspapers in Britain than can survive, and I would expect several of them to disappear or merge in the next 10 years. So I think there is going to be a shakeout there. The other thing that's happening at the moment is that we see new digital-only news organisations that have appeared that are funded by VC money in many cases, and they are not required to make a profit. They'll build the audience and make the profit later or something, and we see lots of examples of this. The best example is probably the Huffington Post because it built a big audience. It sold itself to AOL for whatever it was, $300 million. It's still not profitable, and it has a big reach, and it gets a lot of its articles free because they're donated to it, and yet it can't make that model work. So I think this idea of the new news organisation that is funded by display advertising and is digital only and is kept alive for a bit by VC, but then eventually you realise it doesn't work. We're starting to see a shakeout there. So Recode has just sold itself to Vox. Yeah. I mean, Vox, I admire their journalism a great deal, but I really don't know how sustainable that model of theirs is.
Yeah, okay, thank you for saying that, because thank you. Just somebody else had to say that.
I mean, I've just looked at all of these people, and Quartz, again, I admire what they do. Obviously, they are a subsidiary of The Atlantic, but essentially they've got funding from The Atlantic. They're loss-making still. They've got some kind of 3-year plan, but I just don't see how they're going to make money. You could do things like events and you could do some sponsored content, but I really don't think that's going to support a very large newsroom. Anyway, I wish them the best of luck. I don't wish these people to fail, but I just look at it and think there's a bubble here. And then the other thing you see is that VCs, some of them seem to be saying, well, some of these new startups, and BuzzFeed is the best example. So Andreessen Horowitz have invested in BuzzFeed, and their justification is that BuzzFeed has built all of its own technology. It has its own publishing systems, has its own analytics systems, its own advertising systems, and therefore it justifies valuing it like a tech firm. I'm really not sure that's true. I'm really not sure how much of an advantage all of those things give BuzzFeed. That said, I think BuzzFeed's model is interesting. I think it's a genuine departure. It's an ad agency wrapped in a news organization, and it's a model that works even when most of your content is read on platforms other than your own website. So BuzzFeed is very happy with things like Apple News and Facebook Instant Articles because it doesn't really mind where it's its content is read, because some of the content is editorial and some of it is advertising.
But there's no Chinese wall then, right?
No, there actually is a Chinese wall at BuzzFeed. So the two kinds of articles are written by different teams. There is a debate about how strong the Chinese wall is and whether, so there you get these periodic flare-ups where people find BuzzFeed editorial articles that seem to have been taken down, possibly because of pressure from advertisers. It's not quite sure. It's not quite clear. So Gorka has been bashing BuzzFeed about this. But anyway, what's interesting is that BuzzFeed does still, whether or not you think they do it well, does still adhere to the idea that you need to have a Chinese wall between those two bits of the company. But the rest of the news of the organisation of the structure there is I think very good. I mean, you have editorial, you have the advertising division, then you have technology. You don't have a kind of binary split between editorial journalists and the whole of the rest of the company, which is what you get in old news organizations. Instead, you have different divisions like events or video that have some editorial people in them, and that's something I've been trying to move towards here. So with Economist Films, which we just set up, instead of saying is it on the editorial side of the wall or is it on the commercial side of the wall, we just said neither. We're not going to answer that question. It is a separate business unit. It reports straight to the CEO and to the editor-in-chief, and it has both editorial and commercial people in it. And I think we're going to need more units within the company like that, so that eventually the Chinese wall, it doesn't go away completely, but it's implemented in a different way. And I think that's sort of the kind of structure we need to move towards.
Yeah, fair enough. But talking about Vox and BuzzFeed,
yep,
that still doesn't solve that problem that you alluded to. That it sort of feels like a bubble, and how sustainable all of that is.
Well, I think the BuzzFeed model itself is possibly the answer. Vice has an internal agency called Virtue, and Virtue is what makes the money, and it makes the sponsor content, and then that goes out in the streams with the other content, and so you use the news organization to build the audience and the credibility for the sponsor content. Although Vice has now moved towards a more straightforward model of simply getting TV stations to pay them to make TV for them, because they seem to be very good at that. So that's probably a simpler model, and you can see why they'd want to move towards that, because it's just, our model is basically the readers pay us for our journalism. That's a nice simple model too.
Yeah, but that's my point. Yeah, that none of the new sort of news organizations are doing that.
Well, there are one or two that are. So The Information would be an example.
Oh, that is true, yeah.
So that's Jessica Lessin's startup. And then, people like Ben Thompson. I mean, obviously Andrew Sullivan tried this with his blog, but it doesn't seem to have worked.
He burnt out, right? I mean, that's how that...
Yeah, and they were very dependent on his personal... it's difficult. They had a key man problem there, which is that what people liked was him and his writing, and it was difficult for him to, find more people and scale himself up. And that's understandable. But anyway, I think we are seeing a shakeout. GigaArm went bust as well.
Yeah.
I think people are starting to look at these companies and saying, actually, are they going to be able to build an audience and then monetize it through advertising? And some of them clearly have the aim of selling themselves to AOL or selling themselves to Yahoo, and that just makes it someone else's problem. But in the long run, is there a new model that can sustain news organizations from advertising? I'm not convinced that there is. So, but we'll see. But I think the answer on both the print and the digital side is that we are going to see a shakeout.
All right. Well, that's okay. That you've calmed me now, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but honestly, because it feels like more of the same with VC money, and we'll figure out how to monetize it later. And I don't know, I don't really, that's going to sound weird, but I don't really care when it's like a tech startup, right? Because if the technology doesn't go anywhere, like, who cares?
Yeah.
But when it's like a news organization, there's a voice in the back of my mind going, this is responsible work, people. Like, this is not... the goal shouldn't be to sell yourself to Yahoo, right?
No, that's true. But the good thing about this, and the good thing about the VC money sloshing around in this business, is that it is leading to lots of innovation, and people are trying lots of things, and then we can look at them and say, oh, that's an interesting way of doing things. What would our take on that be? So I like it in that respect. Of course, it also bids up the price of journalists, so that's not quite so great. But I mean, ultimately, it does, when VCs throw money at a field, even if they don't end up making money, and most of them won't, it does encourage people to try new things and to innovate. And I think that does have a collective benefit.
Okay, so now we'll move to the last 3 questions, which are always the same. So we're going to talk about your hardware and your software.
Oh, okay.
Which basically means what do you use to get work done, and your phone and your tablet and
yeah. Okay, so I have an iPhone 6 Plus, which I love, and then I have a quite old MacBook Air. The MacBook Air 11, when it came out, it was 2010 was it? I think it was 2010, wasn't it? Yeah.
Does it have the backlit keyboard or no?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
It's really old. Right. So, and what's really funny about it is that I don't think I've ever owned a computer for as long as that computer, because it's getting on for 5 years now, and it's still great. I mean, because it doesn't have a hard disk, it doesn't bog down, and you can just keep open Word and Excel and Slack and Photoshop, and it just keeps on going. It's great, and Chrome with millions of tabs. So I do like the look of the new 12-inch ones, and I'll probably buy one of those in the next 6 months. But
you'll hate the keyboard. You will.
No, I went and tried it. Actually, I didn't mind it. So
honestly,
yeah,
we had a review on it. Just okay.
Yeah, okay.
Fine.
Well, it's obviously something that divides people very deeply. But although people say it's underpowered, it's actually slightly more powerful than the 2011 MacBook Air 11-inch. So for me, it's going to be like a speed boost. That's going to be great. But it's really not about performance. That thing is fast enough. And I think the crucial step was removing hard disks from computers. That really stops them thrashing. And
SSDs. Yeah. SSDs, yes.
Yeah, SSDs is the way to go. So anyway, I'm very. That's quite an old computer, and I can't think of when I last had the same computer for 5 years, and I could frankly go on using it for probably a couple more. But as I say, I like the look of the new one. So that's the hardware piece of the puzzle. And then, of course, the very important question is, what about the gaming side of things? on that side, I am an Xbox fan, and what I like about the Xbox One actually is it's starting to. Microsoft is very clearly. I think this will be the last console they'll make, and they're just going to push people towards gaming PCs. But well, maybe I'm wrong. But it's clear that the Xbox One is able to do a lot of the things it can, because it's really just a PC, and so you could get PC games to run on it very easily. You can port things easily, and so we're getting quite a lot of the benefits of the PC gaming community. Things like mods in Skyrim or whatever. Bethesda just said that you could move mods over to the Xbox, and of course you can, because it's the same architecture. It's actually quite a nice. It's quite a nice. Console to have, I think, because it's kind of it means I can avoid having a PC to game on, and it means that the what you can do on a PC, which I sometimes look at and say, oh, I wish I had a PC and I could do those things, and then I think, no, I don't want a PC, I don't want to get involved with having a PC, and I think that less and less, because the Xbox One is becoming more PC-like, or taking on the benefits of PC gaming.
Yeah, it's basically a really good PC you hook up to your TV.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's just, it's exactly.
I'm an Xbox fan as well, so,
Yeah, okay, good. So I've been playing Elite this week, which is fantastic. I remember Elite from the first time around in 1983 and 84, and God, it's so nostalgic. I'm loving it.
Oh yeah, I've been doing the same sort of trip down memory lane with Knights of the Old Republic on the iPad.
Oh yes, I have to confess I've done that too. Yeah, so.
Oh, just so great.
That was the game. You may be like me, that I had not played RPGs before, and so many people said this is a game that will convert you to RPGs, and that even people who don't think they like RPGs like this game. Well, isn't it fantastic? Yes, good old KOTOR. I love that game.
Yeah, I was the same. Just stayed clear of RPGs, and then somehow found KOTOR way back when. And yeah.
And then then you can move on to Skyrim and all that stuff.
Oh, and then The Witcher 3. I have a coworker you'd get along with, because he just.
Right. Okay. I keep seeing stuff about The Witcher, actually, and thinking, maybe I should investigate this. Maybe that's next. But Elite is going to eat my life, I think, for the next couple of months. So.
Oh yeah, it's a time suck, but it's a fun time suck. So yeah,
it is indeed.
Okay, and software wise, okay, since you're a 6 Plus user, let's I don't know, top 5 apps on the phone.
Well, I could of course ask the phone itself what the most used are, so that's quite easily done. But maybe I'll come up with a slightly less rigorous and more interesting answer than that. Well, clearly Twitter.
Well, yeah. So what, official client, or what are you on?
Yeah, I just use the official client.
Really? Okay, that's...
Yes. I know that's not very fashionable, but I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, it's supposed to be Tweetbot, Tom. It's supposed to be Tweetbot.
Well, but they've limited the number of people who can use those apps, haven't they? So,
yeah.
So I've always been very happy with just the native client and the native website. Obviously Gmail and Instagram, and then what games am I playing? The Slack app is obviously something I use quite often, and things I've recently started playing with. Nuzzle is quite fun. Been mucking around with Cardboard and all the various VR apps that you can use on the with the Cardboard headset. So that's quite good. Two Dots is probably the game I've played the most, and Alto's Adventure. They're the games I've been playing most in the last month on my phone. That probably covers most of it. Oh, I could just double tap and see what the most recent apps are. Espresso, there it is. Facebook, Nuzzle, Hangouts.
I love how people never, when I ask these questions, right? They never say Facebook unless they look at their phone, right? I think it's just assumed, I guess.
Yes. No, it's just obvious. It's like email. It's like not saying Chrome or Gmail. Yeah. No, those seem to be the main ones.
Okay. And then my final question, Tom. If you had to pick one physical thing that's not your grandmother, it's not supposed to be a human being, right?
Yes.
That you feel like it was made for you. You might still have it. You might not. But that one thing that made you, did you feel it was made for you?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because I'm not terribly sentimental about things.
Yeah, I'm the same way. That's why I ask.
When I leave home and when I go on holiday, I kind of think, well, as long as all my data's safe in the cloud and I've got my laptop in my bag, and as long as my family's safe, I really don't mind if the house burns down, because there isn't that much that. My drum kit isn't in the house anyway; it's in storage. But even my drum kit, drum kits come and go. I'm not that attached to them. And cars come and go. I mean, I quite like the car I have at the moment. I'm very. I suppose I am more attached to that car than I have been to. I just appreciate the engineering in that car.
Okay, I'll take that as the answer then, because okay.
Yeah, so it's a Mercedes B class, and it's the first car I've had with an automatic gearbox. Having always thought that automatics were not for me, but then I rented a car last year on holiday, and it had a dual clutch automatic, and I just thought, this is fantastic. I know what, and their mileage is better on. So anyway, I got this B class, but it also has this hilarious feature we call it the coffee alert, and it's where it can tell if you're falling asleep on a long drive. and it's what it's doing, it's monitoring a number of things: the cabin temperature, the length of the trip. But the main thing it's looking at is how many micro corrections you make on the steering, because the number that you make is a very, very good indicator of how alert you are.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, and so driving back from a long trip, and we've done some quite long trips in the past year to weddings and things on the other side of the country, and after sort of 3 or 4 hours, I'll think, I think I'm doing okay. I don't need to stop for coffee. And then the car will go beep, and I'll say, well, no, I'm fine, really. I'm fine, really. But it calls it much earlier, and then it'll go off again, 5 minutes later, and I'll say, actually, I am feeling a bit drowsy. So that is a kind of cute technology trick on a car that is overall beautifully engineered anyway, and I just I love the toys, and I can't wait till the self-driving features start to get clever as well. And then when the cars go away altogether, we just have self-driving pods that we summon with the Uber app. I'm totally there. I went in a self-driving car in Shanghai, as I said, but I also went in the self-driving pods at Heathrow Airport.
Oh right, yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
and they're pretty amazing as well. So I'm ready for that future. So even the car, I'm not that sentimental about, and I don't feel I have to own one. And it doesn't.
Yeah, well, I'll take that as the answer, just because of the.
But take it as the answer anyway, because exactly.
Just the coffee alert thing is awesome.
Yeah, so. It is. It's a great. It's a good toy.
Tom, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for doing this and talking to me. Honestly.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Tole je bila 105. epizoda Aparatusa. Toma najdete na Twitterju pod @Standage. Jaz sem na Twitterju @AnZT, tako da mi tam tešte, če vam je bilo kul ali pa ne. Drugač, dajte kakšno oceno v iTunesih Aparatusu, mislim, da se jih je že 151 nabrali, tako da hvala unim, ki ste jo že dali. Kot vedno pa najbolj lahko podprete Aparatus tako, da ga pač dejansko podprete. To naredite tako, da greste na aparatus.si/podpri in še enkrat Ibariver hvala unim, ki ste to že naredili. To je naslednjič to. Jaz sem bil že, to ne vem, zakaj sem zdaj rekel, ampak evo, ajde, čau.